In reality, it was quite unusual for gladiators to fight to the death. Training and maintaining a gladiator was an expensive undertaking and people didn't want to see their investment evaporate. So mostly, fights ended when one contestant was exhausted, he would have his wounds patched up, go through what he had done wrong with his trainer, and be back in the amphitheater on the next public holiday. But the Romans were a bloodthirsty crew. They enjoyed various imaginative forms of public execution, not least people condemned at bestias, thrown to the beast, usually dogs, but lions on special occasions. Compare this to European countries before the 19th century, where huge crowds gathered to watch people hanged, sometimes drawn and quartered, broken on the wheel, and beheaded. The last person to be publicly guillotined in France was in 1939, so we can claim a moral advantage over the Romans on that score. Why did the ancient Romans enjoy gladiator fights in the arena? What was the psychology behind gladiators fighting to the death? Let me drop a bombshell on you. Historically speaking, gladiators rarely killed one another, and this was also generally quite frowned upon. Capital I like to think of gladiatorial combat firstly as a sport. A very dangerous sport involving sharp-edged weapons, but still a sport. Gladiators could become quite famous, and draw in giant crowds, so it'd be quite bad for business to kill them off, as bets were taken on the fights. Famous gladiators and chariot racers would be like the famous basketball and football players of today. Gladiators also trained in special schools, where they learned not only how to fight, but also how to fight in a way that looked cool while still minimizing the damage they dealt with their opponents. Single sword blows can easily kill even strong people, and, since most gladiators didn't wear armor that protected their vitals well, they'd easily be dispatched by a blow to the stomach or chest. So, what looks more fun for the audience? Which option would generate more money from bets? Two guys go at one another with swords, and one just bleeds out from the first major blow that lands. What would happen if they just used actual combat technique? Two guys, who we'll call Quintus and Valerius, go at one another with swords, intentionally delivering little more than superficial cuts to the forearm in front of the leg for quite some time, dancing around, parrying artfully, before Valerius gets tired, starts slowing down, and takes a more major blow, and surrenders honorably, to fight another day, gets carted off to the sidelines, where the best doctor around treats his wound. Perhaps this sets up a revenge arc for Valerius, and he publicly disses Quintus, challenging him to a grudge match. Perhaps the bit about the revenge arc is a bit of historical fiction, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's at least some precedent. Besides just swords, gladiators often used a plethora of less lethal weapons. One of my favorites is the retiarius, a gladiator who fought with a weighted fishing net and a trident. He'd capture his enemy, and then just sort of poking him until he gave up. Sometimes, just the humiliation of being caught in a net in front of thousands of spectators was enough to make them surrender. Second favorite gladiator is the cestus, a lad who went into the ring wearing nothing more than a tunic and some brass knuckles. The retiarius also had a cousin of sorts who used a lasso and a dagger. Imagine the feeling. You stroll onto the sand, feeling yourself, and there he is, Gaius, the retiarius. You square up, and you dance around, dodging his thrusts before he gets you in his net. Not how you thought this would go. Now, he's got a trident to your throat. Are you going to surrender or let him stab you with it? Other cool gladiatorial combats that were done, sometimes, they'd flood the Colosseum and put ships in there. Teams of gladiators would try to sink the enemy ships by ramming them. Other times, they'd even act out famous naval battles, with fewer ships of course. Gladiator versus animal fights. Found some weird thing the size of a house down in Africa, Asia, or up north in Britannica? Cartas on down to Roman seas if the best beast fighters, forgot their Latin name, but that's the rough translation, can kill it. Often, these fights would attract crowds that were large enough they would have to build extra rows of seating around the top of the Colosseum. This isn't to say that sometimes gladiators didn't fight to the death. They did, often because they were compelled by masters or higher status citizens to. However, most thought that gladiators who did this were just as insane as the sick people who would put on such a show. Imagine if somebody paid two boxers a few million to get into the ring and fight to the death. That'll give you an idea of the general reaction of the Roman populace to fights to the death. Anyways, that about wraps up my ramble on this. If you want to learn more, there's this great thing called the internet. Hope this helps. For the same reason people today enjoy football, American football, hockey, basketball, UFC, act, etc. Except that in our modern societies, mainstream entertainment organizations have a lot of regulations and rules. But, at least by the 1st century, the majority of gladiatorial matches were not to the death. Sure, people died, on a level we would find appalling today. But they were not necessarily fighting to the death. These used to be slaves and criminals, but the demographic became freemen, debtors, noblemen, senators, etc. Excerpt from one of my previous answers: how is this different from gladiatorial combat? Criminals and captured slaves were indeed used in combat. By the 1st century CE, the demographic changed. These warriors were often desperate men or ex-soldiers skilled in fighting. But some were upper-class patricians, knights, and even senators eager to demonstrate their warrior pedigree. Being a gladiator could bring you wealth, fame, prestige, and women. Being a gladiator did not mean there can only be one survivor. These guys were usually highly trained professionals. You don't deplete your supply of such a commodity. Nor would free men enter the arena knowing they were most likely in the fight to the death. The job was to entertain